Good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of 12 O'Clock High, a podcast about leadership. We're going to continue our periodic series on Best Picture winners or Academy Award winners for the Best Picture, to be a little bit more correct. We're going to do All Quiet on the Western Front. The book itself came out not too long after World War One, and was apparently quite a sensation. It was ultimately banned by the Nazis, as was the sequel. But it describes the experiences of Paul Baumer, a 20-year-old German, and six of his classmates who volunteered to serve in the war on the Western Front, mainly because they believed the propaganda instilled in them by their teacher, Menet Kantorek. The novel features graphic descriptions of the violence and cost of war that were fairly shocking at the time to those who had not experienced them personally. And one by one, his friends are killed, and eventually leaving him alone. A trip home on leave reveals he no longer has any meaningful connection to civilians or civilian life, leading him to question what will happen to him following the war. One of the most famous scenes involves he and a Frenchman are trapped in a shell hole in the no man's land, and Paul stabs him to death, but then frantically tries to keep him alive. Difficult book and movie, and as I said, it was fairly remarkable for its time, the realism. The film offers us a lot of insights into teamwork and human resilience, and I think even into leadership. The small team of classmates, the outsiders, including a character named Himmelstoss, who's a drill sergeant and postmaster, showing how the habits of petty bureaucracy can destroy a functioning team. Kat's ability to circumvent the rules by scrounging for food and helping them all survive. You have the constant theme of the absolute gulf between leadership and workers, resulting in or soldiers, resulting in the total alienation of the people who are actually fighting the war. So, Tom, I've got some thoughts on the nature of war and its unpredictability and how this affects our lessons in leadership. Would you like to discuss some of that?
Sure, Richard. And I've taken, whenever I interview a vet today, to ask them what lesson they learned in the military that they've been able to bring forward in civilian life. And these have been men who perhaps fought after 9/11 in the Gulf Wars or Iraq or Afghanistan even. So we have another generation who've experienced war here in America, and they learned a lot. And what one of the points that was re-driven home for me in rewatching this movie is because of the extremes of war, that you get extreme behaviors, obviously extreme emotions, but you get extreme leadership responding to extreme situations. And sometimes that can be down to the unit level. It can be with the sergeant. It could be with the officers. I think you're spot on to note the disconnect between the officer corps and the men in the trenches, probably on both sides, but here focus on the German side, and how the small unit of men was literally decimated one by one throughout the war. But you see adaptability and ability to survive in the harshest of circumstances. That adaptability is a skill that I often wonder about, Richard. I once heard Robert Kennedy Sr., Bobby Kennedy, talk about being the commander of a naval boat in World War II at age 18. And what he learned from that was how to get things done, not simply under the stress of being in a war, but with the stress of never having enough of anything. And it taught him not simply resilience, but that literally that you could rely on yourself and your men to get things done. And I saw that here. That's an important lesson. The drill sergeant has always fascinated me because he starts off as, in my mind, the stereotypical or caricature even of a drill sergeant driving the men to near suicide with his petty bureaucracy. But later on, when someone dies under his watch as a drill sergeant, and he's busted down to private, and he has to go to the front line, and he's treated with respect by his former men who had been under him in when he was a drill sergeant for being a private in the German army, and they don't take advantage of him. They don't berate him. They don't physically attack him. They welcome him in as private, and they give him the respect that he should be given as an officer, not an officer, excuse me, as a member of the German armed forces. And so that always struck me, that they were able to see beyond what they may have perceived as hatred, belligerence, or anything other negative. And I just have to draw the lesson that I was taught early on in the energy industry, which don't ever piss off somebody who works for you, because you may be working for them one day. And it was certainly true in the energy industry, where a lot of people change jobs. And so you may be working for someone who worked under you or for you. The ability of soldiers literally in the front lines to adapt to unpredictable environments is something that we're recording this in February of 2025. And in the legal and regulatory environment that I typically play in, it's been literally chaos since January 20th. And so what I'm trying to counsel companies is to have a framework in place that allows you to manage your risks as they change, and they are changing almost daily, whether that's a tariff risk, whether it's a deep seek technological development risk, whether it's a country that we thought was our ally and now apparently as an economic competitor is not our ally anymore, if you're trying to import or use your supply chain through that country. And so having that flexibility and that resiliency has become even more critical for a variety of corporate functions, but certainly in supply chain, procurement, compliance, legal, and those. And that's one of the things I saw at the most extreme level in this movie and the book. And I just have to echo your comments on the book. This is an incredibly powerful book. I think it was written in the late 20s without the graphicness that we have in 2025 in novels. It conveyed the horror of war as well as just about any other book on war I've read. It still is jolting today. Were there any instances of emotional intelligence or empathy or other sort of leadership skills we've talked about over the past several episodes that you saw here?
Yeah, it's often most notable by its absence. The struggle to stay sane requires a level of detachment that really only allows for small groups and direct contact with the same stresses to have any understanding. And I think understanding has to be the basis for empathy. Emotional intelligence, we haven't really talked about how to develop it. I think, like leadership, it is a characteristic that can be certainly strengthened through study. But for instance, there's the scene where one of the classmates has had his leg amputated and he's dying in the hospital, and one of his friends asks for his boots, and that causes sort of shock. But it's an utterly rational request. He's not going to need them anymore. But it's an example of lack of emotional intelligence and empathy. The other thing that you see is the horror at being helpless when something like 8 million horses and mules were killed during the course of the war. And one of the things you see over and over in the memoirs is how horrible that was. The screams of the horses as they were disemboweled by artillery and were dying in the mud profoundly affected people. I don't know if you've seen the play War Horse. It was very interesting and emotionally tearjerker type of thing, but it brought that to the forefront. And then you also have the chasm between the warriors and the civilians, even when they're when Paul goes home on leave, he meets with the mother of one of his dead friends, and he's trying very hard to connect, but he can't. So again, we see the harm caused by a lack of empathy and a lack of emotional intelligence, but there's not much hope for how to fix it. In the business setting, it was typically viewed as a weakness in any event. But the idea that loyalty is a two-way street is something that does go through the book at your discussion of Himmelstoss, for instance. And then but the use of empathy and emotional intelligence in the modern workplace, I think, is difficult because of the distance technology sometimes puts between us. But it's important in both fostering loyalty and the retention of employees. Tone of emails and texts is so hard to get right. The old rule that you would sit on something for 24 hours before you send it has been utterly rendered irrelevant by the pace at which business operates today. It's still a good idea. It's just not something you can actually use in practice, I don't think. But again, the practice, it's that old cliche about walking a mile in a man's shoes. Practicing empathy and practicing trying to understand what people are going through, I think, has a great deal to do with fostering a sense of teamwork. And what do you think about the lessons we have for resilience here?
Richard, I interviewed a gentleman named John Lee Dumas, and he was a senior in college in ROTC on 9/11. And that evening, his ROTC unit met, and the sergeant said, "Boys, you're going to war." And he knew that minute he was going to war somewhere. He didn't know where. And he was one of the first troops in Iraq. He was a 20-year-old tank commander and surrounded by 46 enlisted men with no idea what to do. And so he learned two things. One was the master sergeant ran the group. So he let the master sergeant run the group. But the other thing he said he learned was make a decision. Whatever the decision is, make it and implement it. And it may not be perfect. It's never going to be perfect because you never have perfect information and you never have perfect time. But if you make a decision, then execute on that. And when he made a decision, he was able to communicate to that master sergeant who would then execute, or as another friend of mine said, execution is where rubber meets the road. Now, those were extreme examples because, once again, he was in a time of war back in the first decade of this year. But I thought in terms of resilience, that's something that's always stuck with me, that he understood the success and literally the lives of his men turned on the master sergeant running the unit as the master sergeant could. And he just basically had to get out of his way while being the lieutenant in charge. And the master sergeant was comfortable with that. Either he'd been trained to do that or he just understood how to run a unit when you had an officer over you. And I guess a couple of things that highlight for me is don't be afraid to make a decision and don't let the good get in the way of the perfect, and don't hold off until you have perfect time or perfect information. That particularly in the times we're in right now, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier, you will not have perfect information. I can guarantee you that because even if there's a pronouncement from the government, the details will not be fleshed out. And so have a system in place, either internally or within your organization, that allows you to intake information and try to make the best decision based upon that. Information may change. And the first set of examples we had was when Trump was going to put a 25% tariff on Colombia and Canada, I think, for failing to take, or Mexico for failing to take immigrants back.
It's hard to keep up.
Yes, to keep up. And then he backed off before it was implemented. But if you were on Sunday night and you were head of procurement or head of supply chain, you were probably talking to your CEO if you were buying coffee from Colombia or importing goods from Mexico. What are we going to do tomorrow? And you had to be ready for that. And I just want people to understand that resiliency means business as usual. One of the most propitious things I heard coming out of the pandemic was we moved from disaster recovery to business resiliency to business as usual. and that's the way it's going to be. And you're going to have to respond within your overall risk management framework. If it's too risky, you may cut to something else. If it's not risky enough, or rather, if it's within your risk parameters, then you can move forward with some alternative. I think companies are going to have to be able have a framework which allows them to manage risks that may change literally on a daily basis. It's one of the things I'm trying to communicate, and I think I got that lesson out of this movie as well.
One of the things that I was thinking about during this movie is there was a book out written by another German about the same time called Storm of Steel. That was basically the old school war novel that more or less exalted the experience of war and how it elevated people. It was obviously more popular with the Nazis than All Quiet on the Western Front. But I'm also about halfway through a book that's very interesting called Rage to Conquer, which is about 12 battles that changed the history of the Western world. Starts with the Trojan War, goes to Alexander, and then proceeds through a number of lesser known battles. And one of the things that's really interesting is it goes back to your statements about the lack of information and the confusion, the cliched fog of war that exists. But that one of the things all these great commanders had was an incredible sense of timing. But by timing, what it meant was not just recognizing the opportunity, but acting at that exact moment. And Alexander in particular was famous for this, recognizing the moment when a cavalry charge break the enemy, opposed to breaking itself on their spears. But that is obviously there are key components to that, the recognition and the active. The other thing that he emphasizes is the absolute love that men had for a grave commander. That's obviously not something all of us can aspire to, but something that shows the importance of the mutual respect and earning that mutual respect from your employees. The situation of war is a little bit different in that it's so dehumanizing and the stakes are literally life or death. But even you can see the difference between what enables people to actually function, which in most cases brings us back to that small unit cohesion and the love and respect that people who are going through the same challenges have for each other. I'm sure that the recent pause in FCPA enforcement is as puzzling to you as it is to me, but it seems to have been based on the complaints of business that the enforcement was so uncertain. And so if so, then that's the reasonable thing to do to try and remove a cause of uncertainty caused by a regulatory system that's supposed to provide a framework for ethical decision making. So anyway, what are your thoughts on that?
I was actually struck, Richard, when we started this podcast years ago about leadership. And I think it was you maybe said in the introduction, we both thought leaders were born, but it turns out that leaders can learn to be leaders. And there's a variety of strategies, tools, techniques that they can learn. And we've explored many of those over this podcast series, but that business leaders can also be well respected and employees can strive to do well if they have a business leader they believe in. And so it may not be that same raw emotional connection that you would have on a field of battle, or if you've been in a war together, or you've been in a campaign or theater together. Nevertheless, that with leadership, you can develop that bond with your employees if they know you've got their back and you've got their back. The other thing is about information, and you touched on information as part of a sort of a two-part information and timing. But I'd like to spend a little bit of time, maybe for the end of my part, about information. And the Department of Justice had developed a framework for best practice compliance programs called the 10 Hallmarks of an Effective Compliance Program. And number 4 related to a chief compliance officer. Did they have the authority, the resources, and expertise? And previously, we focused on the authority, which meant did they have access to the board of directors if they needed it? We focused on expertise, were you really qualified and competent to be a chief compliance officer in a multi-billion dollar multinational corporation? And resources meant budget and headcount. I've now come around to thinking that resources means data and access to data and tools to help you have a data-driven program, because without the data, you're essentially making decisions on your gut basis. And so I'm really thinking that in 2025 and 2030 and beyond, it's going to be about who can capture the data, who can analyze the data, and who can implement the solutions suggested by the data. Alexander had data, but it was all in his gut, and he executed quite well. You and I may not have that same skill, but if we have access to data and an appropriate tool which helps us to analyze that data, whether it's in the form of ChatGPT or whether it's in the form of a data scientist or anything in between, that perhaps it would allow corporations to navigate not only the complexity of where we are now, but as I've mentioned several times, the risks that shift literally on a daily basis. So I'm going to make a plug for data and tools to help you analyze that data.
I think that's a great point. I think in a lot of areas we're all sort of drowning in data. Frankly, I don't understand how some of these tools are being used, but certainly Elon Musk and his Doge team seem to be using artificial intelligence and data analysis algorithms to get inside the OODA loop of their adversaries. And it's working quite well for them. They're so far ahead that the reaction of the opponents is a day or two behind, which is a lot in the modern business world. The movie itself ends, spoiler alert, with Paul being killed by a sniper. And in the book, the phrase is that it was a day so unremarkable that the log, whatever it was, simply said, "All quiet on the Western Front." One man's death was not even worth noting. And it was when I read the book first as a teenager, it was a startling end about the callousness of the large operations such as that. But again, it's also one of the first wars where frankly, I can't think of a commander from World War I who had the love of his soldiers to the extent Patton did in World War II, or Montgomery for the British, or certainly much less Alexander. But I think that's in part because the nature of war was changing so fast. They were drowning in a sea of data, not all of which was good, as is true today. But I think you're right that one of the lessons we can see from this is the importance of decision-making under conditions of uncertainty, the importance of decisiveness, but the importance of doing your homework first before making that commitment.
First of all, kudos for using my favorite word ever, the ode. Well done, but you're spot on there. I've really enjoyed this podcast, Richard, because it may seem like a difficult chore to draw leadership lessons from a 1927 book about World War I that was made into a movie 3 years later or 4 years later. But I think a lot of the lessons we've been able to tease out are applicable in times of great change, even if it's, hopefully not a shooting war. I've really enjoyed our exploration of this movie and this book.
I have too, Tom. It's very interesting because I've seen the movie several times. I've read the book a couple of times, and it pays read, and that's not true of a lot of books. But I also agree that it has been a fascinating journey. to realize that movies like this can have, and I guess it's the importance of art in general, that when done properly, it can have lessons that are applicable to realms far beyond what would be apparent. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion, and I hope it leads you to go back and either revisit the movie or the book. I think they're both wonderful. But for now, that's all from Richard Lummis and Tom Fox on 12 O'Clock High.